covered the summarizing of documents. Remember that for the content point under evidence, you can get points for summarizing the main idea. Okay, to get 1 point, how many documents do you need to summarize and use? 3. To get 2 points, how many documents do you need to summarize and use?
4.
And then how many pieces of outside SFI do you need to give in your whole essay to get 1 point? Remember, for evidence, you're supposed to use the documents, but you're also supposed to use outside evidence. So 1 piece of outside SFI, 1 fact that is relevant to your prompt and is not already mentioned in the documents, you can bring that in a sentence to get a full point. Okay, so these are the evidence points of summarizing the documents, using the documents as evidence to prove your thesis. But then you have to go further to a higher order analysis skill for analysis and reasoning. Now, one of the points under analysis is complexity, which we're already familiar with from the LEQ essays, right? But then a new point that you didn't have on the LEQ is the happy point. Okay, the happy point. So H, A, P, P, and Y. What does H stand for?
Historical context.
Good, historical context. What about A? What is A?
Audience.
The audience of the document. What about P? Purpose. What about the last P?
Point of view.
Point of view. Okay. Then once you have discussed the context, audience, purpose, or point of view, you have to explain how or why the H, A, P, or P is relevant to your argument. How does this support your thesis? Now, how many documents do I have to happy to get the point? How many out of the 7 do I need to do happy for?
2.
I have to do
2.
different docs, okay, out of the 7. And I don't need to do H and A and P and P. I could do or. So let's say for document 1, I do H and Y, the historical context and how or why it's relevant to the argument. Then for document 2, I do H and Y, and that would get me a point. I could also do H for all of them. I could do a different one for each of them. Okay, but as long as I
At least 2 documents.
with the happy, right, then I'm good. What if I do document 1 and I give historical context and audience and purpose and why? Does that count as 3 documents for 1 point? No, because the rubric specifically says you have to use
At least 2 documents.
So don't just think, oh, I'm going to do H and A and P and Y for just document 1, get that over with, and then boom. Because according to the rubric, you've only done 1 out of
At least 2 documents.
So just pick which one of these is the strongest one to use, and then explain how or why it's actually relevant, okay? And you can't just identify the context or the audience or the point of view or the purpose and then leave it at that, okay? Like, let's say that, for instance, I had that journal from Christopher Columbus, and I said, the purpose of this document is to record information for history. One, that's not accurate. Okay, that would be true for any historical document. And then 2, rather than just identifying the purpose, you should explain how or why you know that that's the purpose. So if for that document instead you said the purpose of this journal entry was to detail Christopher Columbus's success in traversing over the ocean to get to Asia and convince his sponsors that they should continue to fund his expeditions, that would be an explanation of how do you know that that's the purpose? Okay, because you explained his sponsors were funding his expeditions. So make sure that you don't just say the audience was the king and the queen and then move on. Okay, you have to say the king and the queen were the audience as they were the sponsor of this particular conquistador, talking about enslaving the Native Americans for their more material wealth for the mother country. You have to be specific. Okay, so like what we did with the evidence points on the rubric, we're going to be looking at the happy point on the rubric and how to apply it to different sources. Okay, so first let's look at this source that it provides us. And the first thing that we do when we see a source is we look at the source line. These are slaves cutting sugarcane on the island of Antigua, circa 1823 by William Clark. Clark was invited to Antigua by plantation owners. Okay, so that's the source line. That's telling us what we're looking at. We are looking at a sugar plantation. We know that sugar is a what crop?
Cash crop.
A cash crop. We know that it is grown and harvested under what labor system? Is it serfdom, indentured servitude, the encomienda? What's the labor system portrayed in this painting?
The asiento.
The asiento. And we also know that under that coerced labor system, the wealth that is accumulated goes where?
Back to the mother country.
Back to the mother country, to the Europeans. Okay. What's the economic policy in which colonies are supposed to provide wealth for the mother country? Mercantilism. Excellent. So y'all, even though we don't have a paragraph to read, we have a ton of information that we can gather from just looking at this image. We just have to be able to describe it accurately. This is showing a sugar plantation where the cash crop of sugar is grown under the asiento, and the profits of that wealth under mercantilism goes back to the mother country. Okay, so just looking at the image and interpreting what's going on there. Now we know that under the asiento, conditions were harsh and brutal. Okay, for instance, how long did people tend to live on these sugar plantations?
2 years.
Yeah, about 2 years. So we have a high death rate. We have brutal conditions, long hours. Okay, and not being able to live long enough to naturally repopulate. But in this image, we see children, right? In this image, we see people with, clean clothing, fully clothed. No one's there with, as an overseer with weapons or a whip to monitor. You see one of the enslaved peoples talking to a European mounted on a horse. Okay, so number 1, it asks us, describe how the image ignores the dangerous conditions of slavery. This is the image of slavery that the plantation owners are putting out. Is this a real picture of what's going on, or is it propaganda? Yeah, this is not a true depiction of what the conditions were like on the sugar plantations. Okay, so how the image ignores the dangerous conditions of slavery? Well, you got to use the image. The image shows children and families in well put together clothes, no patches. You don't see anyone like overseers. You don't see violence being enacted against them, right? And you don't see the number of hours that they're forced to work. This doesn't make slavery look all of that terrible. And that's the point of the plantation owners commissioning this painting to be created in the first place, because it is propaganda. We know historically, we have the historical facts on our side, that there were brutal and inhumane conditions of slavery, an extremely high death rate, okay, long hours, very little food, the idea of being owned as property rather than being your own individual, not even to mention the kidnapping of these populations from Africa in the first place, right? So we know that slavery was incredibly cruel and inhumane, but that's not being reflected in this image, is it? So you have to answer the question of why? Why would this image ignore the real conditions of slave labor in the sugar plantations? What is their purpose in putting forth this false whitewashed image of life on the sugar plantations? Why would plantation owners be interested in paying an artist to depict slavery in this way as opposed to how it is in reality? Good, Sam. To make it look like it's not as bad as it is. By painting this labor system, the asiento, in a positive light, that means that fewer people are going to be aghast at the conditions. Fewer people are going to want to fight for abolition, okay? Because if they look at the actual conditions of slavery, right, the brutal conditions, they'd be like, oh my gosh, how could we do this to another human being? But if you get a rosy picture, okay, a false picture of what it's like, then you're less likely to be outraged. Okay, so why would they pay an artist to depict slavery in a positive light? Because they're using the asiento, they're using slavery, and that slave system makes them money. Okay, this free and coerced labor system means that they don't have to pay their workers, and that all of that profit goes to them. Do they want that to stop? No. So if people start looking too closely at slavery and its conditions, then we might start seeing pushes for abolition, which would economically damage the plantation owners. So they're trying to get ahead of it and say, let's get some propaganda out. Let's pay this guy, invite him to our sugar plantation, and then have him paint what's going on in a positive light. And now, since William Clark is getting paid by these plantation owners, he's going to do what they want. They commission him for a piece of art, and he's going to meet their standards for that. So you can say that there's bias inherent in that. But like we said before, you can't just identify a bias and say it is biased and then move on. You have to explain how or why. You can't just identify. You have to explain how or why. So here on this slide, we have 3 statements that attempt to do the analysis point. They attempt to do happy for the painting that we just looked at. So let's look at number 1. The document is from the point of view of a European, so it is biased. Would this get the point or would it not get the point? Say in the chat, yes, it would get the point, or no, it would not. No, it would not. Okay, why? It identifies the point of view, a European, right? But doesn't tell us the how or why that point of view would be relevant to an argument. And simply saying it's biased doesn't explain. Like, yes, it is biased. That is a factual statement. The painting is biased because it's from the point of view of a European. But why is the point of view being European one of the reasons that it's biased? Okay, explain what the purpose behind that, like why is the European's view biased? Because it goes back to wealth and mercantilism, right? Number 2, Clark was invited to Antigua by plantation owners, so his point of view is biased. Would number 2 qualify or not qualify for happy? Good, Theo. It would not, because it has the same issue as we saw in the first statement. It doesn't answer how or why. It says Clark is biased because he was invited by plantation owners. But how does him being invited by plantation owners make him biased? Okay, explain how or why. You can't just say they are biased because European. They are biased because they were paid by blah, blah, blah. Okay, go into more detail about that. Number 3, the purpose of the source is to show slaves cutting sugarcane on the island of Antigua circa 1823. Clark was invited to Antigua by plantation owners, so he cannot be trusted. Would this qualify or no? So let's look at the document. Remember that you can't copy and paste from the document. Now you would think that with this being a painting, it would be really difficult to copy and paste, right? And so what most students do in error is that when they try to summarize the document, they just copy the source line. Slaves cutting sugarcane on the island of Antigua. At this time, Clark was invited by plantation owners. Y'all, that's word for word what the source line said, okay, in this document. So if we put quotation marks around everything that was copied word for word and then cross it out because we can't grade that, we're left with the purpose of the source is to show, so he cannot be trusted. That doesn't tell us the purpose. Okay, saying that the purpose of the painting is to show a picture of something, that's a little bit too on the nose. You're going to have to be more specific. The purpose of painting is painting, like, yes. Okay, but what's the motive behind it? So he cannot be trusted. Again, how or why? You took something from the document. He was invited by the plantation owners, but you don't explain how that impacts his credibility, how that influences potential bias. You have to explain he's being paid by the people benefiting from slavery to depict the conditions of slavery. That's going to mean he's going to depict the conditions in a more positive light to please his employers, right? Because they want to secure their source of wealth. Okay, so none of these sample answers would qualify for the point. You can't just identify the point of view or purpose or the audience. You can't just say, oh, they're biased. You have to be able to explain why. Okay. And now, in the next slide, we have an example that does earn the point. Okay, so we're going to see, they're going to do historical context, they're going to do audience, and they're going to do purpose. Now, do they have to do all three of those for one document? No. It's just that this illustrative example shows how you could do historical context or audience or purpose. Okay, so first up, Clark's image gives a misleading version of what work was like on a sugar plantation. This is our content statement. If we were going to summarize that document, we wouldn't just copy the source line of this shows slaves cutting sugarcane in Antigua in 1823, right? We would give more detail on that. The image gives a misleading version of what it was like on the sugar plantation. The image shows well-dressed men and women working. Again, showing content, what is actually in the image. None of the hardships or violence of slavery are shown. High death rates due to harsh punishments, working long, hot hours in a sugar mill, and the humiliation of being treated like property are absent. This is historical context. None of that's depicted in the image. That has to be information that you already know. The image is depicting a false version of what slavery was like on the plantation, but you know from our lectures what the actual conditions were like. So for context, in period 2, this is what life on the sugar plantation looked like. High death rates, harsh punishments, long hot hours, being treated like property, none of which is depicted in this painting. Okay, so they did content and context. Let's see how they apply purpose and audience. In Britain at this time, many people were protesting against slavery. Okay, so in period 3, this could also be context, historical context, for what was going on during the time in which the source was created. Now, what do we call, what's the vocab word for the end of slavery?
Abolition.
Abolition. Good. So there is an abolition movement going on in Britain right now. Those who invited Clark to Antigua may have hoped that his images would present a more positive version of Caribbean slavery. Here we see the purpose. Why did the plantation owners hire this painter to paint this painting in the first place? Because they want to present a positive image of Caribbean slavery, to convince the abolitionists to stop protesting. Okay, so showing a pleasant group working together for a common cause, it tells us what's in the image. It tells us the historical context. This is what slavery was actually like. This is what's going on in Britain at the time. And then here's why, the purpose. Okay, here's why the painting was commissioned in the first place. And who are they targeting? Who's their audience? British abolitionists. To show them this propaganda of, hey, look, the thing you're protesting isn't worth protesting. Like, look at how pleasant the group is, and they're working together for a common cause. That whitewashing, okay, and propaganda with that image. Okay, now, if you do H and A and P for one document, that still counts as one document. So this by itself does not get the 1 point. You'd have to do this for 3 documents, not having to do H and A and P, but just picking one of these. So like, let's say that I really like doing historical context for the document. Okay, I could take out the purpose and I could get the point for just talking about the historical context. That's fine. Okay, I just have to do this for 3 of the 7 documents. Alrighty, so we have finished with the lecture on DBQ activities. But now we have worksheet 2, which was the one that was printed for you. Yes, David?
Can you do the happy point along with the summarizing point together, like you do the context and then the summary?
Yeah, so let's say to get 1 point for content, you have to do 3 documents. So you do doc 1, doc 2, and doc 3. Okay, so you do content for each of these, summarizing the document. Document 1 shows blah, blah, blah. Document 2 shows blah, blah, blah. In that same place, you should also, not necessarily in the same sentence, you should also do your happy skill. So let's say that for document 1, I gave the content, the summary, and then I did historical context and why. Then for document 2, I did purpose and why. And for document 3, I went back and did historical context and why. I have summarized the content of 3 documents, and that's 1 point. And then I've done happy for 3 documents, and that is 1 point. And they're all the same document. So absolutely, you should put those together. Don't go document 1 summary, document 2 summary, document 3 summary, and then circle back to happy. Okay, make sure you put it in an order that is aesthetically pleasing.
Miss McNeely,
Hmm?
do you have to like say that this is a summary of document 1 and all that, or
No,
you just
that should be understood by the reader. So you wouldn't have to start out your sentence with document 1 shows blah, blah, blah. Okay. You could say like this one, Clark's image gives a misleading version of what work was like on a sugar plantation. That's the summary.
thank you.
Right? All right. So did that answer your question, baby?
Yes, ma'am.
Gotcha.
Are you supposed to put like parentheses and like doc number at the end of it?
Yeah. So like, let's pretend that this document, let's label it doc A. So when I talk about it, I would, at the end of the sentence, take out this period, put in parentheses, doc A, end parentheses, period, right? Or here, the misleading version of what work was like on a sugar plantation, doc A. You should always put it in parentheses. So that tells the reader how many documents you used.
So after it says, after you wrote doc A, then it talks about what the image shows. Would you put it before that or after that? Or
You
does
could
it not
do-
matter?
It doesn't matter as long as I can identify which document you're using. Like if for sentence 1, you're using document A and you cite it, and then sentence 2 is still doc A, sentence 3 is still doc A, and you haven't switched documents, then I understand that it's a continuation of doc A. But if you switch
Okay.
to another one, that's when you have to do the citation again.
Well, could you write doc A twice?
You could write doc A as many times as you want, but I'm not going to
Okay.
count it as 3 different documents.
Alrighty, thank you.
All right, so the last part for this lecture is worksheet number 2, which you should have completed already as a homework assignment. So I want y'all to tell me in the chat what you put for these answer choices. One of the sentences is going to be crossed out, okay, or with an X because it's not relevant to the prompt. And then the other sentences should be put in the order in which they're supposed to appear to have the paragraph make sense. In last class period, there were a lot of different answers. Okay, one is X. Because after 1492, many European explorers crossed the Atlantic motivated by gold, glory, and God. That's describing causes of the Columbian exchange. The prompt specifically says the effects of the Columbian exchange on the African population and the European population. Okay, not causes. So we can cross out the first one. So we know that our topic sentence is going to give effects or an effect, and it's going to address Europe and Africa. And then our evidence is going to focus on Europe and then Africa. So our topic sentence would be here. The Columbian exchange increased the population of Europe, but decreased the population in Africa. An increase in population and decrease in population is an effect. It talked about Africa and Europe. So that's our topic sentence. Every sentence after that is going to be evidence. So first, we start off with Europe. How did it increase the population? Well, new crops from the Americas changed the population demographics of Europe. Then we have to give it evidence of what those crops were. Potatoes, a new plant for Europeans, became a staple in the Irish diet. That when a potato famine occurred in the 1840s, millions starved. This once unknown crop, that's talking about potatoes. So this sentence has to come after this sentence. So they're paired together. This once unknown crop became a primary food for many Europeans. The remaining sentences don't talk about European population anymore. Here we have African population, and then sugar from the plantations. So now we're switching. We had the topic sentence was sentence 1. The effects on Europe were sentences 2, 3, and 4. Now we're talking about the effects on Africa. However, transition. Since Europe increased its population, that's a contrast to Africa decreasing their population. Okay, so 5 would be here. Africans were captured and forced to work due to this transatlantic slave trade, often on sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean. Sugar from these plantations, these telling us that it's related back as a pronoun to the ones mentioned in this sentence, means that these two sentences are paired together. And so the sentences on Africa are sentences 5, 6, and 7. So we have a body paragraph with a topic sentence that says, here's an effect on Europe, here's an effect on Africa, and then here is my evidence proving my claim.